The Roman Empire stands as one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history, stretching its influence across 3 continents and dominating the Mediterranean world for centuries. Rome's legions carved out a realm that seemed destined to swallow the known world. The question that has puzzled historians for generations is simple. Why did Rome? To understand this, we must journey back through the empire's foundations, its rise, and the hidden barriers that defined its ultimate limits. In its early days, Rome was not an empire, but a small city-state nestled along the banks of the Tiber River. Surrounded by rival tribes and kingdoms, it grew through necessity, fighting to survive in a violent and unpredictable world. Each victory secured new territory, new resources, and new manpower, allowing Rome to defend itself more effectively. And expansion was no longer merely defensive. It was an expectation, almost a civic duty. Yet even in those early centuries, limits existed. As the Roman Republic transformed into the Roman Empire, under Augustus, the first emperor, Rome's territories stretched from Spain to Syria. The Mediterranean had become a Roman lake. In a rare moment of restraint, beyond them lay lands too wild, too poor, or too distant to justify the cost of subjugation. Geography was one of the silent forces that dictated the limits of Roman expansion. The empire's greatest natural advantage was the Mediterranean Sea. But the further Rome moved away from this maritime core, the harder it became to supply armies and maintain control. The deserts of the Middle East, the dense forests of Germania, the mountains of Scotland, and the endless steppes beyond the Danube each posed unique challenges. Nature, in many cases, proved to be the empire's most formidable opponent. Julius Caesar had glimpsed its potential during his campaigns in Gaul, but he also recognized the ferocity of its tribes. After Caesar's death, Augustus sent his stepson Drusus, and later Tiberius, to push the frontier beyond the Rhine. When 3 Roman legions were annihilated by an alliance of Germanic tribes under Arminius, the loss sent shockwaves through the empire. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological scar that permanently changed Rome's approach to conquest in the north. The Teutoburg disaster convinced Augustus and his successors that not all lands were worth conquering. The Romans found no great cities to seize, no rich mines to exploit, no infrastructure to integrate. Its decentralized tribal societies could retreat into the wilderness, making permanent occupation nearly impossible. The costs of holding such territory would outweigh the benefits, a calculation that even the most ambitious emperors could not ignore. The Romans, intoxicated by their victories in Greece, Egypt, and the Levant, looked hungrily toward Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization and home to immense wealth. Its skilled cavalry, vast open plains, and highly mobile armies neutralized the Roman legion's traditional strengths. Rome's heavy infantry, unmatched in Europe, where an entire Roman army was annihilated. Beyond military challenges, there were deep political and economic realities that curbed Rome's ambition. Supply lines had to stretch over mountains, rivers, and deserts, often for hundreds of miles. Maintaining stability in such vast territories was a monumental task, one that drained the empire's treasury. Conquest brought short-term wealth but long-term costs. Even the spoils of victory could not offset the ongoing expense of keeping distant regions loyal and pacified. Trajan's conquests in Dacia and Mesopotamia were spectacular, earning him the title of Optimus Princeps. He withdrew from Mesopotamia and built walls, most famously in Britain, to mark the outer boundaries of Roman control. Hadrian's Wall symbolized a new era in Roman policy, an empire more focused on preservation than conquest. Expansion was no longer seen as a necessity for survival, but as a threat to stability. For centuries, the empire's economy and politics had been structured around the idea of continuous growth. The empire had to learn how to sustain itself within its borders, a challenge that would eventually expose internal weaknesses. The endless frontier wars drained manpower and finances, while internal divisions, Political corruption, civil wars, and class conflicts consumed the energies once directed outward. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Rome's ruling elite had grown accustomed to luxury and peace. The glory of conquest, once central to Roman identity, the Roman people, weary of taxation and conscription. Rome's empire was now an organism seeking balance rather than expansion, its ambitions tempered by centuries of experience. In the Republic, expansion had been justified through the concept of defensive imperialism. This doctrine celebrated stability, law, and order within existing borders rather than the chaos of new conquests. The empire began to see itself not as an aggressor, but as a guardian of civilization. Nevertheless, the dream of conquest never fully disappeared. Yet every attempt ultimately ended in retreat or disaster. Armies sent to distant lands found themselves cut off from supplies and reinforcements, vulnerable to local revolts or hostile terrain. Conquest without consolidation was meaningless. In the north, the Scottish highlands and the German forests remained stubbornly unconquered. In the east, the deserts of Arabia and the mountains of Persia resisted Roman influence. These were not just geographical obstacles, they were existential boundaries, reminding Rome of its finite reach. Each region represented a point where human ambition met the raw power of nature and logistics. Some historians argue that Rome's greatest limitation was not physical but systemic, was designed for Mediterranean societies with established cities, bureaucracies, and agriculture. Beyond the Mediterranean world, such structures were rare. In places like Germania or sub-Saharan Africa, Rome found itself facing decentralized societies resistant to its methods of control. Messages could take weeks or months to travel from one end of the empire to another. Orders from the emperor could arrive too late to prevent rebellions or disasters. Expansion beyond certain limits would have turned this logistical lag into chaos. Maintaining unity in a pre-industrial world required proximity. Economically, the empire faced diminishing returns from conquest. Beyond the frontiers, Rome found little gold or fertile farmland, and the trade routes that could enrich it were already in its hands. The empire had reached a point where stability, not expansion, became the smarter strategy. There was also a moral dimension that evolved over time. But by the height of the empire, philosophical movements like Stoicism and later Christianity began reshaping the Roman worldview. Conquest came to be seen by some as unnecessary aggression. Emperors who pursued reckless expansion risked not only military defeat, but public disapproval and divine disfavor. Another factor often overlooked was the strain on manpower. Rome's military machine required hundreds of thousands of soldiers to maintain its frontiers. The balance between offensive ambition and defensive necessity grew increasingly unsustainable. By limiting expansion, emperors could focus on securing what they already possessed rather than overextending into unwinnable campaigns. The Senate and the people of Rome, too, became wary of ambitious generals. Men like Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had turned their foreign conquests into personal power, destabilizing the state. After Augustus, emperors were cautious about allowing generals too much glory abroad. Expansion risked not only foreign resistance, but domestic upheaval. It was safer to govern a secure empire than to gamble on new territories that might inspire rebellion at home. The empire had reached a point of equilibrium where it could sustain peace and prosperity across its vast domain without constant warfare. The Mediterranean world had been unified, trade flourished, and Roman law brought order to millions. For the first time in history, stability became more valuable than conquest. The empire no longer needed to grow to prove its greatness. It simply needed to endure. The outer provinces required constant vigilance against raids and uprisings. Rome's borders were living frontiers, not static lines on a map. The empire's choice to stop expanding did not bring peace forever. Eventually, the same forces that once drove its conquests would return in reverse, as invasions, migrations, and the slow unraveling of its western provinces. Still, the decision to halt expansion was arguably one of the wisest in ancient history. It allowed Rome to survive far longer than it might have otherwise. Empires that expand endlessly tend to collapse quickly. Rome, by contrast, endured for centuries, adapting, stabilizing, and evolving within its limits. The walls it built were not just physical, but philosophical, a recognition that true power lies not in infinite conquest, but in lasting governance. The empire had reached the edge of the possible world, the point where geography, economy, and humanity converged. Beyond those limits lay lands unconquerable, not by strength, but by circumstance. Rome's greatness, in the end, was not measured by how far it went, but by how long it lasted. Could the empire have gone further if it had chosen a different strategy? In the next part, we'll explore the economic, political, and social mechanisms that made expansion impossible. The Roman Empire's decision to stop expanding was not made overnight. It was the product of centuries of experience, of countless wars that tested the limits of its endurance. Beneath the surface of this decision lay a complex web of political, economic, and social realities. To understand why Rome could not expand further, we must step inside the machinery of empire to see how it functioned, how it fed itself, and how it reached a point where its own structure became its greatest constraint. The very system that had built the empire eventually became the reason it could grow no more. At the heart of Rome's expansion was its military machine. For centuries, Rome's armies had been unmatched in discipline, organization, and strategy. But by the 2nd century CE, the character of this army had begun to change. In the Republic, soldiers had been citizens fighting for the state, landowners with a personal stake in victory. As the empire matured, the legions became a professional standing army, loyal not to the Senate or the people, but to the emperor who paid them. This professionalization was necessary for control, but came at a cost. Expansion now depended on imperial funding and political will, not on the collective ambition of the Roman populace. The Roman military economy was a colossal engine that consumed wealth at an astonishing rate. Every campaign required months of preparation: weapons, food, transport animals, siege equipment, and pay for tens of thousands of men. In the age of conquest, these costs were offset by the spoils of war. New provinces brought slaves, gold, and tribute that replenished the treasury. But once expansion halted, that stream of income dried up. Without new territories to exploit, the empire was forced to fund its military machine from within, through taxation. This shift turned expansion from a profitable venture into a financial burden. The emperor's treasury, known as the fiscus, became increasingly strained. Maintaining the frontiers required a permanent military presence. Legions stationed along the Rhine, the Danube, in Syria, and in North Africa. These soldiers were not conquering new lands, they were defending existing ones. Their pay had to be raised periodically to maintain loyalty, especially as inflation began to erode the value of currency. The more the empire tried to secure its borders, the more it had to spend, until defense consumed nearly the entire imperial budget. Expansion under such conditions was simply impossible. Economics was not the only limiting factor. A political system of the empire, while effective at maintaining order, discouraged risk. Emperors who launched ambitious campaigns faced immense political danger. A failed war could lead to rebellion, loss of prestige, or even assassination. Roman history was filled with cautionary tales, emperors who gambled on conquest and lost everything. Augustus' warning against overextension had become almost sacred law. The Senate, once the champion of Roman glory, now valued stability above all. In such an environment, caution was safer than courage. The bureaucracy that managed the empire was vast and sophisticated, but it also suffered from inertia. Each province was governed by officials appointed from Rome, tasked with collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and maintaining order. The larger the empire grew, the harder it became to monitor these officials. Corruption spread like a disease. Provincial governors skimmed taxes, delayed payments, and exploited local populations. These inefficiencies made it difficult to sustain the kind of financial surplus needed for expansion. The empire had become a self-feeding bureaucracy, focused on survival rather than growth. Rome's social structure also played a crucial role in its stagnation. The empire relied heavily on slave labor, drawn from conquered peoples. As expansion slowed, the supply of new slaves declined. This shortage began to affect agriculture, mining, and construction, the economic backbone of Rome. Landowners faced labor shortages, production fell, and prices rose. In response, emperors introduced heavy taxation to make up for lost revenue, further burdening the provinces. A society built on conquest could not easily adapt to peace. The demographics of the empire began to shift as well. Continuous wars and plagues reduced the population, particularly among free citizens. The army increasingly relied on recruits from non-Roman regions, Germans, Thracians, Syrians, and others. These soldiers fought well, but lacked deep loyalty to Rome's ideals. Over time, the legions became a patchwork of cultures, held together by pay rather than patriotism. Expansion under such conditions was risky. An army that did not share a common identity could easily turn against itself. In addition, the empire faced the problem of succession. The death of an emperor often triggered crises, civil wars, assassinations, and power struggles that drained resources. Each time a new emperor seized power, he needed to secure the loyalty of the army, often by offering bonuses or pardons. This cycle of instability made long-term planning difficult. Emperors rarely ruled long enough to pursue consistent expansionist policies. Most were too occupied with internal survival to dream of foreign conquest. Another obstacle was the sheer administrative complexity of managing conquered lands. When Rome annexed a new region, it had to integrate it into its system of governance, building roads, cities, aqueducts, and tax systems. These investments were enormous and took decades to pay off. Without reliable local elites to manage affairs, Rome had to send its own officials, stretching the administrative core thin. Expansion thus created a paradox. The larger the empire grew, the more fragile it became. Beyond the material limits, there were psychological and cultural transformations within Rome itself. The empire had become comfortable. The elite, once hardened by generations of war, now lived in luxury. The urban aristocracy preferred the safety of political games to the uncertainty of battlefields. Conquest no longer defined their identity. Instead, art, philosophy, and architecture became symbols of greatness. The empire that once thrived on expansion had evolved into one that glorified preservation, an empire of peace rather than conquest. Religious change also reshaped the imperial mindset. In the early centuries, Roman religion celebrated victory and divine favor in war. The gods of Mars and Jupiter had guided the legions to glory. But as Christianity spread, the moral foundation of the empire began to shift. War and conquest became morally questionable acts in the eyes of the new faith. By the 4th century, under Constantine and his successors, the emphasis turned from worldly domination to spiritual salvation. Expansion no longer fit the empire's moral narrative. Meanwhile, external pressures made further expansion impractical. On nearly every frontier, Rome faced powerful adversaries. In the east, the Parthian and later the Sassanid empires were strong centralized states with disciplined armies. In the north, Germanic tribes continued to evolve, forming confederations capable of challenging Rome's legions. Beyond the Sahara and the Arabian deserts lay lands that could not be sustained by Roman logistics. Every direction led to regions where the cost of conquest exceeded the benefit. Geography, once Rome's ally, had become a trap. The empire's borders followed natural barriers, rivers, deserts, and mountains that were both defensible and confining. The Rhine and Danube served as Europe's northern walls, but beyond them lay vast, untamed wilderness. Crossing these barriers required immense effort, only to claim lands with little economic return. Even Britain, though conquered, proved costly to maintain. Beyond Hadrian's Wall, the highlands and moors were impossible to control, forcing Rome to retreat and fortify rather than expand. The empire's reliance on local economies also restricted its movement. Roman logistics were based on supply chains drawn from established provinces. Armies marched on food and silver. Each step beyond the frontier required creating new depots, roads, and settlements. Unlike nomadic empires that could move freely, Rome's power was tied to its infrastructure. Expansion into undeveloped territories meant building civilization from scratch, a task far too expensive for a weary empire. Cultural integration, one of Rome's greatest strengths, also had its limits. Within the empire, diverse peoples were united by Roman law, language, and citizenship. But beyond the frontiers, such integration was nearly impossible. Many societies lacked the urban traditions or hierarchical structures that Rome relied on for control. Diplomacy worked only where elites existed to negotiate with. In tribal regions, there were no such intermediaries. Expansion required not just conquest, but transformation, something even Rome could not endlessly repeat. Rome's shift from offense to defense was formalized during the reign of Diocletian. His reforms divided the empire into smaller administrative units and created a new system of frontier defense known as the limes. Forts, watchtowers, and walls stretched across thousands of miles, manned by permanent garrisons. This defensive strategy was pragmatic but symbolic. It acknowledged that the age of conquest was over. The empire would now survive by defending its borders, not by crossing them. Over time, this defensive posture changed the very psychology of the empire. The frontier, once a place of opportunity and glory, became a line of fear. Soldiers stationed along the limes lived isolated lives, cut off from the heart of the empire. Their mission was no longer to conquer, but to endure. This shift in mindset eroded the aggressive spirit that had once fueled expansion. The Roman soldier of the 2nd century was a guardian, not an explorer. Economic inflation further crippled Rome's capacity for war. As silver mines declined and the government debased its currency, inflation soared. Prices rose, trade declined, and the value of soldiers' pay plummeted. To maintain loyalty, emperors issued even more coins, worsening the crisis. The resulting economic spiral left the empire unable to fund new campaigns. Conquest was a luxury it could no longer afford. Environmental changes also played a subtle but significant role. The Roman warm period, which had provided stable climates for agriculture, began to cool in the 3rd century. Harvests failed, and food shortages spread across the empire. Feeding armies became increasingly difficult, especially on distant frontiers. Expansion into new territories under such conditions would have been suicidal. The empire had to focus on feeding its existing population rather than conquering new lands. There was also the problem of over-centralization. The emperor held absolute power, but even the most capable ruler could not manage every detail of an empire stretching thousands of miles. Communication delays meant that decisions made in Rome could be obsolete by the time they reached the provinces. Local governors acted independently, often prioritizing regional stability over imperial ambition. The result was a fragmented empire, strong at the center but increasingly paralyzed at the edges. In many ways, Rome became a victim of its own success. Its system of roads, laws, and trade created a world so interconnected that peace was more profitable than war. Merchants, governors, and citizens had no desire to disrupt the order that made them wealthy. Expansion risked destabilizing this delicate balance. The empire's greatest strength, its unity, depended on avoiding unnecessary wars. Meanwhile, the outside world was changing faster than Rome could adapt. New powers emerged beyond its borders, adopting and improving Roman military techniques. The Germanic tribes became more organized, the Persians more sophisticated, and the steppe nomads more mobile. Rome could no longer rely on technological or tactical superiority to guarantee victory. Expansion into such territories meant facing equals, not inferiors. Even the concept of empire itself evolved. Rome began to see its mission not as endless conquest, but as eternal preservation, to bring order and civilization wherever it already ruled. This ideological transformation, deeply rooted in Roman identity, justified restraint. The empire was eternal because it no longer needed to grow. It had already encompassed the known world. Expansion beyond that was not destiny, but excess. In this light, Rome's decision to stop expanding was both practical and philosophical. It recognized the limits of its age, technological, logistical, and moral. The empire could not conquer deserts without modern transport, nor mountains without modern supply chains. It could not govern vast, decentralized societies with ancient bureaucracy. Its borders were the natural boundaries of its time. Rome, in a sense, had reached the horizon of the ancient world. Yet even as expansion ceased, the myth of conquest endured. Roman emperors continued to celebrate military victories, even when they were small or symbolic. Triumphs were staged for defensive battles, and inscriptions proclaimed the glory of restoring peace rather than winning new lands. The language of conquest survived long after the reality had faded. It was as if Rome, though no longer expanding, still needed the illusion of growth to sustain its identity. Ultimately, the empire's limits were not failures, but boundaries drawn by reality. No power in the ancient world could have surpassed them. Beyond those borders lay the unknown regions that would only be explored centuries later by other civilizations. Rome had reached as far as any empire could in its time. Its genius lay not in infinite expansion, but in the ability to endure, adapt, and influence the world for millennia. The decision to halt expansion ensured Rome's survival for hundreds of years after its peak. But it also planted the seeds of future decline. Without new conquests, the empire lost its economic engine, its sense of purpose, and its unifying ambition. The very restraint that had preserved it would, in time, contribute to its fall. When expansion ended, stagnation began, and the empire slowly turned inward. The story of Rome's limits, then, is a story of balance, between ambition and endurance, between power and restraint. It is the story of a civilization that conquered the world it could reach and accepted the world it could not. In the next part, we will explore how this balance began to crumble, how internal decay, external pressure, and the loss of purpose transformed Rome from an empire of conquest into one of survival, and eventually into history itself. When the Roman Empire chose to halt its expansion, it did not realize that this decision would reshape its destiny. What began as a pragmatic choice to defend what was already built slowly transformed into a symptom of decline. The endless energy that once fueled Roman conquest began to fade. Without new lands to seize, new wealth to plunder, and new enemies to defeat, the empire turned inward. This shift from an offensive to a defensive civilization marked the beginning of a long, subtle unraveling that would eventually bring the mighty empire to its knees. In the centuries that followed Augustus' stabilization, Rome perfected the art of maintenance. Roads were repaired, cities adorned, frontiers fortified. Yet beneath this polished exterior, cracks were forming. The empire's economy depended on expansion. Its taxation system, military rewards, and political legitimacy all relied on new sources of income. Once those ceased, Rome had to extract wealth from within, taxing its own citizens and provinces to sustain the vast machinery of empire. What had once been a cycle of conquest and reward became one of exploitation and exhaustion. The provinces, once the empire's greatest asset, slowly turned into burdens. Governors and tax collectors squeezed every ounce of wealth from farmers and merchants. The local elites, who once embraced Roman rule for the prosperity it brought, began to resent the relentless demands of imperial taxation. Cities declined, trade faltered, and rural poverty spread. The empire that had once promised civilization and prosperity now seemed like a system of endless tribute. Expansion had stopped, but the hunger of the empire had not. The Roman army, once the most disciplined and feared force in history, also began to change. With no major wars of conquest, soldiers became frontier guards rather than conquerors. They built walls, manned fortresses, and patrolled borders, monotonous work compared to the glory of battle. Over generations, their fighting spirit dulled. Pay became more important than patriotism. Loyalty was no longer to the idea of Rome, but to the general who could promise the highest reward. This transformation eroded the unity that had once made Roman armies unstoppable. Recruitment became increasingly difficult. As Roman citizens lost interest in military service, emperors turned to the provinces and eventually to foreign mercenaries. Germanic and Sarmatian tribesmen filled the ranks of legions once proud to be Roman. These men fought well, but they did not share Rome's identity. The empire had once Romanized the conquered. Now the conquered served to defend Rome itself. Expansion had reversed. The outer world was now within the army, and the line between Rome and its enemies began to blur. Meanwhile, the political center of the empire grew weaker. The emperors of the later centuries ruled more like administrators than conquerors. Bureaucracy expanded, while true vision declined. Imperial succession became a game of survival, with generals, senators, and palace guards competing for power. Without the unifying goal of expansion, politics turned inward, consumed by corruption, intrigue, and fear. Civil wars became frequent, not for the glory of conquest, but for control of the imperial throne. Each civil conflict drained resources that might have been used to strengthen the frontiers. Whole legions were recalled from distant provinces to fight fellow Romans. Cities were plundered by their own armies. The empire's infrastructure, aqueducts, roads, bridges, began to decay as funds were redirected to internal wars. The balance between expansion and preservation was lost. Rome had once grown through ambition. Now it was devouring itself through desperation. As the internal structure weakened, external enemies sensed opportunity. The Germanic tribes, once contained beyond the Rhine and Danube, grew stronger and bolder. They learned Roman tactics, built their own alliances, and launched raids across the frontiers. The Sassanid Empire in the east challenged Rome's authority in Mesopotamia, pushing the boundaries of Roman control. For centuries, Rome had relied on the stability of its borders. Now, those borders became porous and uncertain. The defensive strategy that had seemed so wise under Augustus and Hadrian began to show its limits. Walls could be built, but not everywhere. The empire's borders stretched for thousands of miles, from the North Sea to the Euphrates River, from the Sahara to the Scottish Highlands. Maintaining such an immense line required resources far beyond what the empire could supply. Frontier forts were understaffed, supply lines stretched thin, and communication delays made coordination impossible. The dream of a secure empire began to crumble under its own weight. Economic instability worsened these problems. With trade routes disrupted by invasions and piracy, the flow of goods across the Mediterranean declined. The once bustling markets of Rome and Alexandria grew quieter. Inflation soared as emperors debased the currency, mixing silver with cheaper metals to fund military expenses. Prices rose, trust in money faded, and barter returned to many regions. The empire's financial system, which had sustained its expansion for centuries, was collapsing. In an attempt to restore order, Emperor Diocletian introduced sweeping reforms. He divided the empire into two halves, the Eastern and Western empires, each ruled by its own emperor and co-emperor. This division was meant to make administration easier, but it also formalized the empire's fragmentation. Rome was no longer one united entity. It had become a pair of sister states, each focused on survival in its own sphere. The spirit of unified conquest had vanished. Diocletian also imposed rigid controls on society. Taxes were fixed, professions became hereditary, and peasants were tied to the land. This system preserved stability, but at the cost of freedom. The empire became a vast machine of regulation, where mobility and innovation were discouraged. It was an empire frozen in place, strong enough to endure, but too rigid to adapt. Expansion, once the essence of Roman vitality, was no longer possible in such a controlled environment. The Eastern Empire, centered in Byzantium, adapted better to these changes. Its wealth, population, and trade routes allowed it to endure for centuries. The Western Empire, however, continued to decline. Without the rich provinces of the East, it struggled to fund its defenses. The once glorious city of Rome, heart of the ancient world, fell into decay. Emperors rarely visited it. The capital shifted to Milan, then Ravenna. The empire that had once ruled continents was now retreating into its own shell. As the 5th century dawned, the consequences of halting expansion became unavoidable. The empire no longer had the means to project power outward or even maintain full control within. Armies were composed largely of federates, foreign allies hired to fight Rome's wars. These groups, such as the Visigoths and Vandals, were given land in exchange for military service. But their loyalty was temporary. When Rome could no longer pay or protect them, they turned on their hosts. In 410 CE, the unimaginable happened. Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric. For the first time in 800 years, the Eternal City was conquered. The world was shocked, but the event was merely a symptom of deeper decay. Rome had stopped expanding centuries earlier. Now it was imploding. The empire had survived not because of new conquests, but because of inertia. Once that inertia failed, there was nothing left to hold it together. In the decades that followed, the Western Empire fragmented completely. Provinces declared independence or fell under barbarian rule. Britain was abandoned, Gaul and Spain overrun, North Africa seized. The great networks of trade and administration that had bound the Mediterranean world together disintegrated. Roads crumbled, aqueducts dried, cities shrank. The Roman world dissolved into a patchwork of kingdoms, marking the dawn of the Middle Ages. Yet even in collapse, Rome's legacy endured. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, carried the torch of Roman civilization for another 1,000 years. From Constantinople, emperors continued to call themselves Romans, ruling over a Christian empire that preserved Roman law, culture, and identity. The dream of expansion was replaced by the mission of preservation. In a sense, the empire had evolved beyond conquest. It had become a custodian of civilization. Looking back, it is tempting to see the halted expansion as a mistake, a failure of ambition that doomed the empire. But in truth, Rome had reached the natural limits of its age. Its roads, armies, and economies could go no further. Beyond its borders lay lands too vast, too hostile, or too barren to sustain Roman life. Every empire in history has faced this point, where growth turns to overreach and preservation becomes the wiser path. Rome's restraint, though it led to decline, was also a recognition of reality. The empire's story reveals a timeless truth about power, that no civilization can expand forever. Conquest brings wealth, but also dependency. Victory brings unity, but also complacency. When the outward journey ends, the struggle turns inward, to maintain, to preserve, to define purpose without progress. Rome mastered the world, but it could not master the consequences of its own success. The same systems that made it strong, bureaucracy, army, economy, became the chains that bound it. Culturally, the shift from expansion to defense had profound effects. Roman art and literature grew nostalgic, obsessed with the glories of the past. Poets and historians wrote of heroes and victories long gone. Monuments were restored, not built. The people of Rome lived in the shadow of their ancestors, unable to recreate their greatness. Expansion had not just stopped geographically, it had stopped spiritually. The empire no longer looked to the future. It worshipped its past. Religion filled the vacuum left by conquest. Christianity, once persecuted, became the empire's official faith. It offered meaning in a time of uncertainty, promising eternal salvation rather than earthly glory. The focus of Roman life shifted from empire to eternity. Expansion of faith replaced expansion of borders. The sword gave way to the cross. In this transformation, Rome changed the world, but it also lost its identity as a conqueror. By the 6th century, the Western Empire was gone, but its echo lingered. The Byzantine emperors dreamed of restoring the old borders, launching campaigns to reclaim lost lands. Under Justinian, parts of Italy, North Africa, and Spain were briefly retaken. But these victories were fleeting, costly, and unsustainable. The empire's resources were stretched thin, and new enemies, Persians, Slav, Arabs, emerged to challenge its strength. The age of conquest was truly over. In the centuries that followed, the memory of Rome's expansion inspired countless imitators: the Holy Roman Empire, the Franks, the Ottomans. Each sought to rebuild what Rome had achieved, to reclaim the lost unity of the ancient world. Yet none could replicate the conditions that had made Rome's rise possible. Geography, technology, and history had moved on. Rome's expansion had been unique, a miracle of timing, discipline, and opportunity that would never come again. And so, when we ask why Rome didn't expand further, the answer is both simple and profound. It didn't because it couldn't, not without destroying itself. Every empire must choose between endless growth and sustainable survival. Rome chose survival, and even that choice eventually consumed it. But in doing so, it left behind something greater than any conquest: an idea. The idea of law, order, and civilization. The Roman ideal would outlive the empire by millennia. From the ashes of halted expansion came the foundations of modern Europe. Roman roads became trade routes. Roman cities became capitals. Roman law became the basis of Western justice. The empire may have stopped expanding, but its influence never did. It spread invisibly through language, architecture, governance, and faith. In this sense, Rome found a new kind of expansion, not territorial, but cultural and spiritual. The story of Rome's halted expansion is not just about military limits or political caution. It is about the life cycle of civilization itself. Growth, consolidation, decline. These are the rhythms that govern all great powers. Rome's genius was not in conquering forever, but in showing how far humanity could go before it met the boundaries of its own creation. Its walls were not signs of weakness, but of wisdom, an acknowledgement that even empires must one day rest. As we look upon the ruins of the Colosseum, the broken aqueducts, and the remnants of Roman roads stretching across continents, we are reminded of what expansion truly means. Rome expanded not just across space, but across time. It conquered the imagination of humanity. And even though its armies stopped marching 2,000 years ago, the empire of its ideas continues to grow. In every government, every city, and every law built upon its foundation. The empire's borders fell, but its civilization never did. Rome, in its restraint, achieved immortality. It stopped expanding on the map, but began expanding in the mind. And that, perhaps, was its greatest victory of all.